So a little bit about why the fuel control will drift rich with altitude. There's kind of a simple way to explain it and a little bit more complex way. Kind of in its simplest form, if you could think of your engines running perfectly, throttle's fixed, power's right where you want it, fuel's perfect. If you could imagine just slowly removing oxygen from the air, well, fuel needs oxygen to burn. So as you take away that oxygen, your fuel's going to drift richer, at least in the sense of combustion. So you're going to notice that you might start to lose power. So that's on its simplest form. A little bit more complex way to look at it is most people think of fuel flow in terms of a certain power setting and say, I want to fly the exact same power. How do I do that as I'm changing altitude? Well, as you climb up in altitude, if you want to maintain the same power, you actually need to get more air to the engine because there's less oxygen to burn your fuel. So what's actually happening is as you're drawing in more air, your fuel flow is going up because the fuel control doesn't know it's at altitude. It's saying, hey, here's more air, give me more fuel. Well, now the pilot needs to compensate for that in order to actually maintain that same power setting. So that's kind of two ways to look at it. In general, though, for every 1,000 feet you climb, you're going to lose about 3% power, and that's just pure physics. That's just because there's less oxygen there to burn, and leaning it, richening it, there's nothing you can do to change that. You're going to lose power with altitude. So temperature and its effect on the engine, specifically air temperature. What's actually happening is as the air gets hotter, it's actually getting less dense. So it's just like climbing up in altitude. So as things get hotter, it's going to go richer. That's just the nature of a mechanical fuel system. So it could be, you might be taking off, it's perfect, it's 60 degrees, and everything's fine. A few weeks later, it's summer, it's 80, 90 degrees. You may see, hey, I'm not making as much static power. What might be going on? If you were to actually do a density altitude calculation and see, oh, I'm at, the engine thinks it's at 3,000 feet. Well, you may actually even need to lean it out on the ground in order to actually get your static RPM. So that's what's happening from a temperature perspective. It's no different than climbing up in altitude. It has that same effect. So a carburetor or fuel injector, they're both naturally going to enrich with altitude. A carburetor, you're going to kind of notice it more. It'll be more pronounced. It'll probably happen sooner, in all honesty. That's just by virtue of how they work. A carburetor is a little bit more, I don't want to use the word crude, but simple in how it operates. They both use a venturi, so they're both basically measuring the speed of the air. That's how they meter the fuel. Now the servo's a little bit better at responding to that. It won't drift as rich, is one way to look at it. But they're both gonna enrich with altitude, with temperature. That's just how they function. But you'll probably notice it'll be a little bit more pronounced on a carburetor. On a large carburetor like an 036 or an 0540, those actually have what's called an economizer, which is linked to where the throttle is set. So you'll probably notice that a little bit more depending on what power setting you're at, because normally what that enrichment through the economizer does is that's basically making sure hey, I'm above 75% power, I need a little bit more fuel flow. Well, if you're right around there and now you're changing altitude and that throttle's changing, you may have to lean a bit more to actually compensate for that economizer circuit. So that's why you may notice it a little bit more on a carburetor over a fuel injector, but they both enrich with altitude. That's just the nature of the beast. So when to start leaning, it kind of depends on if you're talking about at takeoff, in flight. So on takeoff, general rule of thumb is you want full rich mixture. Now the caveat with that is where you're taking off from. Some POHs 172 for instance, they're basically saying above 3,000 feet density altitude, you're allowed to lean it to make best power for takeoff. Lycoming manuals, they kind of leave it a little bit more vague. It's just high elevation airports. But in general, that 3,000 to 5,000 feet, you're probably going to need to start leaning it. That's just how these things operate. So that's essentially when you should start leaning. Now, in terms of how much to lean it, that depends on if you're trying to make best power, best economy, how much fuel you're trying to save. Most of the POHs basically spell out where you should try and dial in your fuel flow based on where you're running your engine at. But in general, anything above about 3,000 feet, you should pretty much expect to need to lean the system out. Carburetor racing and vapor lock, those are two pretty serious things that'll affect how your engine's performing. Carb ice, that can happen in a wide range of temperatures, even when it's warm. But basically with carburetor icing, what's happening is as that air is going through the venturi, while you're getting a pressure drop, and the pressure drop's changing the air temperature, it gets cooler. Now, as you start adding in fuel to that equation, so to speak, as that fuel's atomizing, it's actually chilling the air down as well. So under the right conditions, you can actually begin to form ice, and that'll start to accumulate on the throttle valve, in the throat of the carburetor. It'll actually start choking the engine of air, so you'll start losing power. And also, it'll actually start making the thing go a little bit richer too, because you're constricting that airflow, so the air is moving faster through it. So carb ice, it's a pretty serious thing. You need to be aware of it. That's why airplanes have carb heat, but it's just being aware of when that can happen and how to respond to it and kind of what the symptoms are. In general, say you're flying at the same altitude, if you start losing power, that's probably the first thing that's going to key your mind that maybe carburetor icing is taking place. Now vapor lock, that's a little bit more complex. Now it depends on where this, vapor lock, if you want to call it, that's occurring. If it's in the fuel pump, it's essentially you're starving the engine of fuel. So as vapor's forming, basically vapor's compressible, the liquid's not. So as vapor's forming, that fuel pump's not actually able to create the fuel pressure that you're looking for, and you'll actually starve your engine of fuel. And the vapor pressure of the fuel varies with the temperature of the fuel. So it's just a matter of when it can occur. Probably the easiest thing, if you ever suspect vapor, is engage the, some people call it a boost pump, emergency pump, the electric fuel pump essentially. That'll raise that fuel pressure. If that smooths it out, you can be pretty confident it was a vapor issue. But it all depends on where that vapor's forming. Is it before the fuel pump, after the fuel pump, in the fuel control itself? They all kind of have somewhat different symptoms, but in general, engaging the emergency pump, the boost pump, that's the best way to mitigate it and resolve that. So as things do tend to start to drift rich, probably the first thing you'll notice is it might start to run a little bit rough. If you get too rich, you'll actually start to lose power, but you'll just notice that, so just for an example, say you're climbing, you've got throttle held fixed. As you climb, you're gonna actually begin to lose power, and that's just from losing oxygen. You can't burn as much fuel. So if you did everything perfect, regardless, your RPM is gonna come down. It's not gonna be able to maintain that same power as you're climbing an elevation.